I had my design class this morning. So I had what I refer to as the most relaxing 3 hours of my week. I get to sit and just, if you ever have the opportunity, because I don't think you have to be a major in order to take design. Could be wrong, but I don't think you have to be an art major to take the design class. So if you ever feel like, doing something sort of out of the nursing and a little more right brain, go take design one. It's super easy and very relaxing. Okay, so we are recording. Make sure you put your name in the chat so that I have them for later. And then we are going to start popping through this. Do you guys have any questions about anything before I get into this PowerPoint? Crickets. Crickets in the WebEx. Okay. All right. Then we are going to pop forward through this PowerPoint. And
is the next chapter that we're on, is that 2 weeks also?
I'd have to go back and look at the syllabus. I don't. What is the next chapter? Digestive? I believe digestive is next, and I don't believe that it's 2 weeks. I believe I gave you 2 weeks for urinary. But the digestive system you will find is much more straightforward and much easier. But if you look at the syllabus, it will tell you in that schedule exactly how many weeks things are. Okay, any questions about this slide? I think we talked about a lot of this last week. So theoretically, it should be pretty straightforward. Questions here? This is just more detail about the alveoli. It's very similar to what we talked about last week. We will get into some new stuff here in a minute, but if you guys have any sort of questions that go back, then feel free to. Ooh, stop that. So I mentioned the respiratory membrane last week. Where would you look? Where do you when I say respiratory membrane, what is the sort of visual that pops into your head? Where do you think of it being?
Mainly near like the alveoli, probably, because it's where the gas exchange happens.
Okay, so it definitely, so the outer membrane of each alveolus is definitely part of the respiratory membrane. So what else would you need in order for there to be a respiratory membrane? So if you've got the fluid and then the alveolar epithelium, and then the membrane that the alveolar epithelium sticks to, and then a space. What's on the other side of the space?
A capillary?
A capillary. So any place where a capillary is up against an alveolus, you're going to have a respiratory membrane. So if we blow this up and you look here, you have the inside of your alveolus and you have the inside of your capillary, right? So in the alveolus, we have water, right? And so you've got this thin layer of fluid, and then you have the epithelial cells that line the edge of the alveoli. What kind of cell is that? The epithelial, Alveolar epithelium. What else do we refer to those cells as?
Pneumocytes. Type 1.
Which kind of pneumocyte?
Type 1.
Type 1 pneumocytes, yes. So we've got the type 1 pneumocytes or the alveolar epithelium. And then you've got the basement membrane, which is what those epithelial cells basically attach to. And then you have this very thin space. And on the other side of the space, you basically just start in the opposite direction, right? So you've got the basement membrane that the capillary cells are attached to. And then you have the capillary cells themselves, right? The endothelium, which is simple squamous epithelial cells. So again, very thin, very irregular shaped cells. And then you have the blood. Okay. So your respiratory membrane includes all of those pieces because that is what oxygen and carbon dioxide have to travel across in order to get into or out of the blood and or alveoli. Does that make sense? So you should know what layers make up the respiratory membrane. You should have an idea of, sort of what it is that the cells have to go through and in what order. Right? If I'm looking at the alveoli and I'm talking about carbon dioxide, what is the first barrier that it's going to cross as it diffuses through the respiratory membrane?
Can you repeat the question?
I can. So I'm talking about carbon dioxide, and I want to know what the first barrier, the first layer of the respiratory membrane is that carbon dioxide is going to have to cross.
Pulmonary capillary endothelium.
Yes. So carbon dioxide will cross the pulmonary capillary endothelium first. What about oxygen?
Would be the
same? Maybe.
Is oxygen traveling in the same direction as carbon dioxide?
No.
No.
So would it be the alveolar fluid?
Yes. Yes. So remember, carbon dioxide is in the blood. We have lots of CO2 here, right? And we have lots of O2 here. And so we want to move, color here, the green. We want to move the O2 into the blood and the CO2 out when we're at the alveoli, right? So they're going to go in opposite directions, which means they're going to cross those layers in an opposite order. Do you see that? Okay. All right. We're going to move forward unless you guys have questions here. When you contract your diaphragm, how would you describe the shape of it when it's contracted? If I have a thoracic cavity, right? I have ribs. And I want to draw in a contracted diaphragm. What's it going to look like?
Would it look almost flat or kind of downward leaning?
Yes, it would be more flat when it's contracted. Okay, this is one of those things that you have to sort of get into your head in order to understand the pressure volume relationships. So when it's relaxed, what's its shape?
It's like a parachute.
It's, yeah, sort of like a parachute or a bell shape. Sort of, it's a curve, right? So when I'm looking at the volume of the thoracic cavity, so I'm talking about this space, okay, versus this space, do I have more volume or less volume when the diaphragm is contracted?
You would have more.
More volume. So volume goes up, which means what happens to the pressure?
Goes down.
Okay, so pressure goes down. So is this going to be inspiration or expiration?
Expiration.
Sorry.
Nope, you're fine. Think about, okay, so volume went up, pressure went down, right? So remember that our normal thoracic cavity pressure is, well, intraalveolar pressure is really what we're talking about here, is about 760 millimeters of mercury, right? Right? Which is equal to 1 atmosphere, right? So the air out here is 1 atmosphere pretty much always, or 760 millimeters of mercury, okay? Now, if the volume went up and the pressure went down, what does that do to my millimeters of mercury?
They go down.
Decrease.
Yeah. How much does it usually go down?
Like 1 or 2.
Like 1 or 2. So we'll say this went down 1, which puts us at 759. Now, which way is the air going to move?
Into the lungs.
Into the lungs. So that would make this inspiration or expiration?
Inspiration.
Inspiration. Okay. Now over here, I have a decrease in volume, which means I have an increase in pressure. So that means that my millimeters of mercury are probably somewhere in the 761 range in here. And atmospheric pressure is 760. So which direction is the air going to move?
Out.
Out, making this expiration. Do you guys see how that works? Just the shape of the diaphragm will affect that. Now, the diaphragm is not the only muscle involved here, right? You've got the intercostals, you've got the pectoralis muscles, you've got the diaphragm, the sternocleidomastoid, you've got the scalenes, all of those things that are going to change shape and change the size of that thoracic cavity. And when you change the size of the thoracic cavity, you also change the intraalveolar pressure. Okay. Does that make sense? Because I think there's
Yeah, so
go ahead.
so pretty much the changes in volume are just saying how much air is going to be available in your chest, and the changes in pressure are telling you which direction that air is going to go.
Changes in volume tell you how much space you have available. The change in pressure will tell you which direction the air will flow. Okay. So for instance, well, hang on. So let's talk about these really quick. If you guys have any questions here. This is just basically sort of giving you an idea of how each of the bones associated with the muscles move in order to make room, right? So the ribs, when you breathe in, will raise like if you were raising a handle on a bucket. So they kind of go up, right? Whereas the sternum will actually kind of kick out like a pump handle, Okay, so if you put your hands on your ribs or on your sternum, you will feel them move along with your breathing. Might be easier for you to do that with somebody else. Make sure that you like them and that they like you before you start putting your hands on them. So you should be able to identify the muscles that are inspiration muscles and the muscles that are expiration muscles. And you should be able to tell me what those muscles do to the volume of the thoracic cavity.
Can we go over that really quickly?
Sure, what part?
It's like the muscles that are for inspiration and then
They're
expiration.
listed right here for you. You just need to know.
Okay.
Yeah, they're listed. So diaphragm, external intercostals, pectoralis minor, and scalene muscles are your inspiration muscles. So when you take a deep breath in, those are the muscles you're using to expand your thoracic cavity. Okay. When you breathe out, when you push all the air out, you've got your internal intercostals, your transverse thoracic, and some of the abdominal muscles that are helping to contract in to push that air out. You just need to be able to identify, not label those muscles, but like know those muscles' names. Okay. Other questions about this? Okay, so we talked about Boyle last week, and the way that they write this out is really complicated, makes it much more complicated than it needs to be. All you need to know is that it's an inverse relationship. As pressure goes up, volume goes down. As pressure goes down, volume goes right? And you can flip that around, right? As volume goes down, pressure goes up. As volume goes up, or as volume goes up, pressure goes down. Okay. If you can keep those two things straight, most of the rest of this is easy. Okay. I'm not going to have you calculating anything. There's not going to be any math. You don't need to know any specific formulas. Okay. You just need to understand the basic relationships that we're talking about here. Okay. Volumes and capacities. I talked a little bit about this in the coffee hour on, I guess that was Tuesday. I did that with you guys. The difference between volumes and capacities is that volumes are a single number. Volumes are a single measurement. Capacities are combinations of volumes. Okay? So that's one thing that will help you keep track of whether or not you're talking about a capacity or a volume. It will also help you with your definitions. If I ask you to identify the inspiratory capacity, you know that you are looking for two or more numbers or two or more volumes that you can put together to create that capacity. Okay? So yes, you need to be able to identify on a graph that I'm going to show you in a minute the volumes and the capacities. You need to understand how the volumes and the capacities relate to each other. Okay. This is actually a really important concept that will follow you for the rest of your nursing career. So when you look at this figure, the first thing is you have the volumes here and the capacities here. And you'll notice that they look very similar, right? Okay. So the thing that I encourage you to do, and this is what I told the people that came to the coffee hour on Tuesday, is I encourage you to draw your own graph. Okay. This is the easiest graph to draw in the world. You don't need the numbers. Okay. The numbers themselves are not important for me. Right? But understanding the relationships is what's important. So we have a graph that's basically going to start out with these regular sized hills and valleys. Okay. Every time you have a hill, that means that your patient has breathed in. And every time you have a valley, they've breathed out. Okay? So these hills and these valleys are all sort of the normal breathing pattern. And we call that the tidal volume. Okay? Tidal volume is just the normal breath you take when you're just sitting and watching TV or sleeping at night, those sorts of things. Okay? Now, after this, hang on. You need to move up here, out of my way, so that I have more room. Okay, come up here. All right, after this valley, we have this really big peak that comes down, and then it goes back to normal, okay? Now, the difference between tidal volume and the peak of this, so this number here is what we call the IRV, the inspiratory reserve capacity. It is also the inspiratory, I'm sorry, it's not the IR, it's the IRV, the inspiratory reserve volume. Okay, because we're just talking about volumes right now. So if this is your normal breathing volume when you breathe in, and this is your IRV, how would you describe IRV?
It's the amount of air that you can like inhale after like what you would normally do.
It's sort of the maximum amount you can pull in, right? If somebody says to you, take a deep breath, as deep a breath as you can take, that's your that is the peak of that. This peak right here is your maximum inspiration. It's the maximum amount of air that you can pull into your lungs. Okay? The IRV, the inspiratory reserve volume, is the volume of space that is available in your lung capacity for you to pull in air if you need to. So the amount beyond your normal tidal volume. Does that make sense? Okay. So we went back to normal tidal volume. And then after normal tidal volume, I'm going to move the end of my graph because I'm not going to have room. Because we're going to come way down here and then go back to normal tidal volume. So remember, that's tidal volume, right? So the difference from here to here is what we call your ERV, or your expiratory reserve volume. What is that?
It's when you're breathing out.
Well, but so is this technically. What specifically is ERV in relationship to tidal volume and IRV?
Is the maximum of it coming out?
Yes.
Okay.
It's the maximum amount of air that you can push out of your lungs. Can you physiologically push all of the air out of your lungs?
No.
No, you can't. There is a maximum amount, right? There has to be some left, otherwise your lungs collapse and you can't breathe at all. So there is a volume down here that we refer to as the reserve or residual, sorry, wrong word, give me that back. Residual volume. Okay, and it's usually about 1 liter of air. But that residual volume is the amount of air that is always left in your lungs, right? It's the amount of air that stays in your lungs after you've reached your ERV, your maximum expiration value or volume. Okay.
So I have a question. I don't know if it's kind of related to this or not.
Okay.
But so when a person snores at night, will their like not graph, but like would the chart look different or would it still be like the same since they're still breathing?
Depends on whether or not the snoring is affecting their air input. Like if somebody's got sleep apnea, yes, for sure, it's going to have an effect. Whether or not snoring has a noticeable effect on a spirometry, I honestly don't know. That would be something I would have to ask. If you've ever had a sleep study done, or you know anybody who's ever had a sleep study done, they might be able to tell you the answer to that. I'll ask some of my friends. I know a lot of people. I have a lot of friends that are on CPAP machines because they're all powerlifters and have necks the size of tree trunks. So they've all had to have sleep studies done in order to get their CPAP machines. So I will check around and see if they can answer that question for us. But I don't know. I can't imagine that it would, because snoring primarily is just a vocal cord effect as air moves. Usually, at least I think that's what it is. Okay. Sorry, not a terribly great answer for that, but I'll see what I can find for you. Okay, so we've gotten ERV and we're back to tidal volume. Okay. Now, that's it. Those are your volumes, right? You've got tidal volume, you've got IRV, you've got ERV, and you've got residual volume. Okay? Those are your volumes. Now, I can combine these volumes to make capacities. Okay? So the biggest capacity is going to include all of them, right? Tidal volume plus IRV plus ERV plus RV is going to equal what?
Your total lung capacity?
Total lung capacity, the total amount of air that your lungs could potentially hold. Okay? So if I then change and I say, okay, I'm just going to use tidal volume plus IRV. Oops, try that again. Plus IRV plus ERV. What's that going to give me?
Vital capacity?
Vital capacity. Now, vital capacity, what does that sound like it might be?
Like what's needed for every day? Like what's vital to you?
It's it's basically the usable air, right? Because what we left off of that is, so this is vital capacity. This is total lung capacity. So what we left off was the residual volume, right? The air that's left behind in the lungs that we're not really doing anything with. We're not breathing it in, we're not breathing it out. It's just kind of hanging out in there, right? It's maintaining space. Okay. So what if I said, okay, I just want to include tidal volume and IRV? What is that?
To your inspiratory capacity?
That's going to be your inspiratory capacity. It's the total amount of air that you can pull into your lungs maximum. And then I can do the same thing and say, okay, I want tidal volume plus ERV. And that gives me what?
Your expiratory capacity? Or no, functional reserve.
So it is, functional reserve and expiratory capacity are basically the same. They're interchangeable terms. It's wrong button. Give me that. Why are you not letting me erase? What's happening here? Thank you. Okay. Functional reserve. Now, is there an easier way for me to write total lung capacity? The formula.
Isn't it just all of them added together?
Right, but is there an easier way for me to do that without having to write all that out?
Probably.
Can't you just do like the IRV plus ERV because it combines like the title?
IRV and ERV by themselves don't tell you anything because they don't include tidal volume. But I could, for instance, do vital capacity plus residual volume. Do you see that? Now, if you wanted to include inspiratory capacity and then add ERV, you could get vital capacity that way, but that seems silly to me. But this one is the shortcut to get to total lung capacity. So basically what I'm showing you here is that all of these volumes give you individual pieces of information. If somebody had asthma, what do you think would happen to their IRV?
Would it go down?
It would be much shorter. And it would be much slower. So if somebody had asthma and you asked them to take a deep breath, what you would see would be something that would slope, and it wouldn't go up as high before it came back down. Okay? Because it's going to take them longer to pull that air in. And so once you understand how these volumes are supposed to look in a spirometry reading, then when you're working as a nurse and you're looking at somebody's breathing patterns, you can identify, okay, there's a breathing problem here. There's a problem happening, and either they're not getting enough air in or they're not able to get enough air out. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. So you should be able to do this. I encourage you, heavily encourage you to draw these things out and make sure that you understand them, because one, I'm likely to ask you questions about these on the exam, and I'm not likely to give you the actual graph. Okay. So if you can draw it out yourself, you don't need the graph from me.
Can we have scratch paper on our exam?
So we talked about this in the thing on Tuesday, and I am fine with you using scratch paper. You need to show the scratch paper to the camera before you start using it. It's going to flag you as doing something inappropriate in my little thing, but I'll just go and look at the camera and see that you were just showing me your scratch paper. And that's fine. There is also a whiteboard that you have access to as part of the tools in Proctorio. And you can use that as well. That you don't have to worry about. It won't flag that because I've given you guys access to that. Okay, so yes, I just need to see both sides of the paper to see that it's blank before you start doing anything with it. And then, yeah, that's fine. Okay. All right, cool. We're going to move forward. So this is running through some of the measurements. Again, I'm not going to ask you to do calculations. Like, I'm not going to ask you to calculate minute volume, but you should know that how you would do that, right? You should know that I need tidal volume and I need respiratory rate. And if I have those two numbers, I can calculate minute volume by multiplying them. And that tells me how much air a patient is moving each minute in and out of their respiratory system. Okay. So respiratory rate, how many breaths you take per minute, times how much air you move, gives you minute volume, which is how much volume of air you're moving per minute. Okay, so you should know what the calculation is, but I'm not going to ask you to actually do the math. Does that make sense? Okay. Other questions about this slide? Again, don't get hung up in the details of these laws. You just need to know that they exist and sort of what they talk about. Okay? Literally what's on this PowerPoint is what you need to know. Okay. This is the figure that I was talking about the other day when I was saying that there's a figure on the PowerPoint that really nicely shows you how the alveoli respond to changes in volume in the lungs, and how that affects sort of the movement of air. Okay, so the two different pressures that we're concerned about primarily are the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure, right? Your atmospheric pressure up here, all of these. And then the intraalveolar pressure, which is the pressure inside of the alveolus. Okay. Now, when the diaphragm is fully relaxed, 100% relaxed, and that is red on red, and that is not going to work really well. Let's try a different color. Let's try green. When the diaphragm is fully relaxed, it's at its biggest bell-shaped curve. What has happened to the size of the thoracic cavity? Has it gotten bigger or has it gotten smaller?
Smaller.
Okay. When the thoracic cavity gets smaller, what does that do to the lung?
Maybe like compress it.
It does. It compresses it down to its smallest functional size. Okay. And if the lung tissue itself gets compressed down to its smallest functional size, what else is going to be at its smallest functional size?
The diaphragm?
Nope. The diaphragm is fully relaxed. The lung itself is at its smallest functional size, and therefore something inside of the lung is at its smallest functional size.
The alveoli.
The alveoli, right? And so if the alveoli has gotten as small as it can get, its pressure is going to equal the atmospheric pressure. Okay. Now, if that makes sense, then the next question I ask should be easy. Is air moving at this point?
No.
No, it's not, right? So think about when you breathe, right? You breathe in, you breathe out, but you don't breathe in and out really fast because that's hyperventilating and you'll pass out, right? There's a break in between every time you breathe in and every time you breathe out. There's a small moment where no air is moving, right? I hope. Okay. So what that tells you is that for a moment after you breathe in and for a moment after you breathe out, barometric pressure and intraalveolar pressure are equal. Because if they're not equal, air is moving. If they are equal, air is not moving. Right? So at the very end of expiration, you reach that, you've breathed out and you're getting ready to start to breathe in again, but you haven't actually done it yet. And so you've got no air moving. So your intraalveolar pressure, so your, oops, isn't that right with here? your intraalveolar pressure, oops, that's a P, equals atmospheric pressure. Okay? Now, as you breathe in, the diaphragm contracts, right? And as the diaphragm contracts, the thoracic cavity gets bigger, which means that the lungs then get bigger. And so the alveoli then get bigger. So we've done what to the volume in the alveoli?
It's increased.
Volume has increased. So this volume has gone up, right? This puts me at, which does what to the pressure?
Decreases it.
Pressure is going to go down, which puts me at like that 759, which means that air is going to flow into lungs from the outside. Okay. Now, again, when you breathe in, there's a moment where things start to balance out. Okay. And it's got to do with the way that the lung tissue functions. And I'm not going to get into all of the physics of this, but just trust me when I tell you, there's a point at which, down here again, intraalveolar pressure equals atmospheric pressure, which means no air movement. Okay, this is at the end of inspiration. So we've gone this way. Okay. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, as the diaphragm starts to relax, we start to compress the lungs. We start to change the intraalveolar pressure again. That intraalveolar pressure starts to go up because the volume has started to go down. That puts us around 761, which means that the air is going to move out and we're going to breathe out. Are you guys following this? It's literally the same thing we talked about last week. It's just a nice visual where you can see the change in the shape of the diaphragm in relationship to the change in the size of the alveoli and how they function. This weirdness over here in number 3, that is related to that intrapulmonary pressure that I told you that we weren't going to worry about, which is why I'm telling you just don't worry about the physics of this. It's got to do with that intrapulmonary stuff, and it's more complicated than I want to get into. Okay. You guys with me?
I think I have a question, but I'm not really sure how to ask it.
Okay.
So like the no air movement, is that when like your body kind of signals itself to be like you need to breathe or you need to like let out your breath? Or like
No.
what does that?
So when you breathe normally, right? Do you breathe in and then immediately breathe back out? No, right? You breathe in, you breathe out. It's a nice rhythm that you exist in where there's an in and a space and an out and a space, right? Now you can consciously control how long that space is. And if you control it for too long, then yes, your body's going to force you to breathe, right? That's the function of having skeletal muscle control over your diaphragm. But subconsciously, when you're sleeping at night, or when you are, sitting on the couch watching TV or not thinking about your breathing, right? There's a space. It's just a moment, it's, a second, maybe less of space where no air is moving. You're not breathing in, you're not breathing out because you've just finished doing one or the other, right? When you get scared, that space gets smaller, right? People who don't have that space, that point where intraalveolar pressure and atmospheric pressure are the same and they're not breathing, they go into hyperventilation. And then they work themselves up to the point that they pass out, right? So this is normal respiratory breathing. Okay, think of it as when you're looking at a spirograph, right? When you're looking at this, you don't go this way, right? There are gradual shifts, and there's a point here and a point here where you're not moving up or down. That's that point where intraalveolar pressure equals atmospheric pressure. Okay, from here to here, where air is moving in, intraalveolar pressure is less than atmospheric pressure. From here to here, intraalveolar pressure is greater than atmospheric pressure. Do you see that? Okay. So that is what breathing is. It's just your muscles changing the size and the shape of your thoracic cavity to change the size and the shape of your lungs, to change the size and the shape of the alveoli in order to make those volume adjustments to allow the pressure changes so that air will move in the direction we need it to move. It's much more complicated than it really needs to be. Does that make sense? Kind of weird, huh? And here you thought you just sucked air in and blew air out. All right, any other questions about this? Okay. Moving forward. Are we okay with these terms?
You said we don't need to know too much about the pleural pressure, just know that it's like the negative pressure and all that.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just it's too complicated for us to get into with the time that we have, particularly trying to do it over the web. You just need to know it exists. You need to know that it's where that idea of negative pressure comes from and that it's generally always a negative number. Okay. Now, if you get stabbed and there's an opening between that where you lose that pleural pressure, if that space goes away, if it's open to the world, then your lung is basically going to collapse and you're not going to be able to breathe. That's a pneumothorax.
So
All
when
right.
people's lungs do collapse, like what causes that?
The loss of those pressure balances, generally speaking, it's why they have to sort of plug the hole in order to get the lung to reinflate. It's all about that negative pressure that sort of helps keep things where it's supposed to be. Questions here?
Are you going hefty on these partial pressures and of oxygen and carbon dioxide?
Am I going to ask you about the numbers? No. Do you need to understand how the pressures change in relationship to one another and in relationship to where they are in the system? Yes. So, when you look at, try again. Undo. When you look at this figure, okay. So, first of all, what kind of respiration is happening up here?
Is it external respiration?
It is. This is external respiration. Okay. So we are trying to move what into the body and what out of the body.
Oxygen in, CO2 out.
Okay, if the goal is to move oxygen in, so O2 in and CO2 out, and we know that we're talking about diffusion, okay? When we look and we compare the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli to the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood, where would we expect to see a higher number?
We're talking about O2, right?
Yeah.
In the alveoli.
Right. You would expect to see a higher number in the alveoli, that's P of partial pressure of 104, as compared to the blood where you have a partial pressure of 40. That's a huge gradient. And what that means is that as this blood goes by, that diffusion is going to happen really fast, and that oxygen is going to move quickly into the blood. Now, what about carbon dioxide? Where would you expect to see a higher partial pressure?
The body,
The blood or in the alveoli?
the blood.
In the blood, right? So partial pressure of 45, partial pressure of 40. What is different about that ratio?
The difference between like the gradients isn't as big, so it'd be slower.
Yes, you're not going to get as much diffusion. You're not likely to move all of the carbon dioxide out as much as you are to move more of the oxygen in. So you're going to move more oxygen in than you are carbon dioxide out. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is that carbon dioxide is how we balance the pH in our blood. And so that that ratio can change depending on what the pH is looking like and how much we need to get rid of versus how much we need to hold on to. Okay. So as the blood moves on, right, we're breathing in here. This is inspiration over here. There's my little light. This is inspiration over here. This is sort of just after we've breathed in. Okay. What do you notice about the relationship between the partial pressures of oxygen here and the partial pressures of carbon dioxide here?
No more gas exchange.
There's no more gas exchange because
we're expelling the air out, and it's focused on just getting rid of the volume of air.
Why did the gas exchange stop?
The partial pressures are equal to each other.
Because the partial pressures are equal, we no longer have a gradient. Okay, that's what I want you paying attention to here, right? The gradient is what's important. If there is a gradient, then those gases will move. If there is no gradient, then those gases won't move anymore. They go till they reach an equilibrium, and then they don't move anymore because it's just a passive diffusion process. Okay, there's no active transport here. This is passive diffusion. You have to have a gradient in order to move these gases in one direction or the other. We have no gradient here, therefore we have no gas movement, right? They're equal. Now, as the blood travels along, what do you notice happening to the partial pressures of oxygen almost immediately?
They drop.
They start to drop, right? All of a sudden, partial pressures of oxygen start to drop as soon as they leave the lungs, and they go through the heart, and they come down into the body. And now let's do our comparison down here. We've arrived at the tissues. We now have what kind of respiration happening?
Internal.
Internal respiration. Okay. We have our partial pressure of oxygen is now higher where?
The blood?
It's higher in the blood, right? We have a partial pressure of oxygen of 95 in the blood and a partial pressure of oxygen of 40 to 20 down in here. Well, interstitial fluid and then the tissues. So In the interstitial fluid, you have a partial pressure of 40, and then in the tissues, you have a partial pressure of 20. So you really got two diffusion processes happening here, right? You've got the diffusion of oxygen from the blood into the interstitial fluids. That's going to happen because I've got this 95 to 40, right? And then I've got another diffusion where oxygen keeps moving from the interstitial fluid into the tissues because I've still got this gradient. Do you see that? Is there anybody who doesn't see this?
Why does the partial pressure of oxygen start decreasing once it goes like through the blood? Is it because like it's slowly like diffusing to other places, or?
Yes. So think about, when the blood leaves the lungs and goes to the heart, it's still traveling by tissues. There are things happening in that process, right?
Okay.
There's some oxygen that gets left that circulates through into the heart, into the lungs themselves. Some of it is going to go straight to the heart, and then you're going to send the rest of it out to the body. Okay. Carbon dioxide. What do you notice about the ratio here? Where's the highest?
Bigger in the tissues and the interstitial space than it is the blood initially.
Yes. So we've got basically this two-step movement from the tissues to the interstitial fluid, from the interstitial fluid into the blood. And it continues happening until the interstitial fluid and the blood partial pressures are at equilibrium. Right? And at that point, that blood heads back to the heart and then back to the lungs to get rid of the carbon dioxide and bring back the oxygen. Does that make sense? Okay. So again, I'm not going to ask you, I don't care about the numbers. I don't care if you remember the 40 and the 50 and the 104 or whatever. I don't care about those. I care that you understand what the ratios are and where you're going to see a higher partial pressure in external respiration and where you're going to see a higher partial pressure in internal respiration, and what stops the diffusion. Understanding that equilibrium gets reached and eventually diffusion stops because there's no gradient. Okay. We've got like 1 minute left. So I am going to, and this probably, oh God, you guys' exam is on Saturday. Okay, I'll do this tonight after I finish with them. I will do a quickie, and I may have already done this on the videos that are on PowerPoint. Do you guys have specific questions about these last few slides? Does anybody have specific questions about these last few slides?
I don't have a specific question. I'm just very confused by the gas exchange in the tissues, like the picture.
This one?
Yeah.
Okay, so all this is showing you, and A&P1 guys, just hang out if you want to. We always run over for you guys, so I'm gonna finish up this PowerPoint for them. You guys can hang out, or you can come back in 10 minutes, whichever you prefer. So with this, all you really need to do is follow the process. This is exactly what we were just talking about, right? So we're talking about gas exchange in the tissues. So we're talking about internal respiration, right? So if we're talking about internal respiration, then we're going to move CO2 into the blood. We're going to move oxygen into the cells, into the tissues, right? Now, what this is walking you through is sort of this process of what happens to that carbon dioxide, okay? So as carbon dioxide diffuses into the blood, there are a couple of things that it's going to happen, that are going to happen, right? The first thing is we've got carbonic anhydrase, carbonic acid, sorry, and water, and they're going to come together and they're going to form carbonic acid, okay? So carbonic anhydrase along with carbon dioxide and water gives us carbonic acid. Okay. That carbonic acid is going to break down, and don't get too hung up in the chloride shift. I'm not going to ask you about the chloride shift. Okay. You do need to know that there is some hemoglobin, right? Some of these hydrogens, these protons are being used for hemoglobin. And when that happens, it encourages the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. And releasing that oxygen from the hemoglobin allows us to send that oxygen out into the tissues. You with me, Bella? Okay. I'm not going to give you this figure to label. I just want you, if you, so let's back up. So if you understand what carbonic anhydrase does, okay, and basically what it does is what?
Carbonic acid.
It forms carbonic acid, and that carbonic acid actually allows us to form our bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. And most of the carbon dioxide in your blood is transported as bicarbonate. Okay, so when we're moving carbon dioxide around in the blood, it's not moving as carbon dioxide. It's mostly 70% of it is moving as bicarbonate, and that bicarbonate is made in this process right here. Okay, this process right here is what makes that bicarbonate. Okay, so you've got some carbon dioxide that's actually being carried by the red blood cells. But most of the carbon dioxide is bicarbonate in the blood, in the bloodstream, just traveling on its own. Okay, that's where that pH stuff comes in. Okay. Now, if you look at it from the other perspective, the only thing that's really happened here is the arrows have changed directions. Okay, this is gas exchange in the lungs. This is your external respiration. Okay, so now oxygen is coming from the lungs into the blood. We're going through and we're taking this bicarbonate, using carbonic anhydrase to break this down, or well, we're breaking down the bicarbonate and releasing water and carbonic acid, and then the carbon dioxide is then being released out into the body. Okay, so don't get too hung up in the detail. I'm not going to ask you about the chloride shift. It's too complicated for us to go into. But really, this is the same thing as what we were talking about a minute ago. It's just including the carbonic anhydrase and helping you understand why it is that most of the carbon dioxide is carried as bicarbonate, and it's not so much your red blood cells hauling carbon dioxide around everywhere. Okay, does that help? Okay, I'm going to pop through these last two. This is important. Make sure you read these headings. This is the effect of partial pressures of oxygen on respiratory rate, and the effect of carbon dioxide on respiratory rate. And then these talk about pH. And again, remember, two separate feedback loops here. Make sure you're taking a look at those. Okay. And that's about it. Any questions? AMP2? You feeling okay about this stuff? Yeah, you'll get it. I was gonna do a happy hour for you guys on Saturday, but since your exam is on Saturday, if you want me to do one on Friday, late Friday afternoon this week, I can do that. AMP2 people, like
I'm okay with that.
5-ish
I'm very okay
Friday.
with that.
5 o'clock on Friday work for everybody? Okay.
Do you know how long it's gonna be? Just because I work until 6 on Friday.
Do I know what?
Do you know how long it might take? Because I work until 6 on Friday.
Let's do this. I'll push it back to 5:30. I can pretty much guarantee we'll be there at least an hour, so that'll get you at least a half an hour. You
Okay.
can always sign in on your phone and just listen to.
Okay.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Cool. I will see AMP2 tomorrow at 5:30. Keep an eye out. Your quiz will be posting at midnight tonight. I'm sure many of you will be up waiting for it. Have a good day. I'll see you guys later. AMP1, stick around. Okay, let's stop the recording.